I was face down on my own shop floor with my heart trying to quit on me when I made my son promise to look after my tools. A month later, while I was still learning to walk to the mailbox and back, he sold every one of them for $2,700. One of those tools, the auction house told me later, was worth $40,000 on its own. He didn't know that. That's not even the part that still keeps me up, friend. The part that keeps me up is that I told him what it was worth in almost those exact words when he was 16 years old, standing at that very bench, and he'd forgotten every syllable of it by the time it mattered. So pour something warm and settle in, because this one's about the difference between a tool and an heirloom, and how a man can hand his son both without the boy ever learning to tell them apart. My name is Eugene, if my mother was calling me in for supper, which she isn't anymore, but the name still answers to both. I'm 74 years old, and for 50 years I have built furniture with my hands in a shop behind my house. And I want to tell you about my grandfather Otto, my son Kevin, and one particular wooden plane the two of them nearly cost me, in two entirely different ways. Let me take you back before any of the trouble, because you can't understand what got lost until you understand what it was. My grandfather's name was Otto Reinholt, and he came over from a village outside Stuttgart in 1885, 17 years old, with a wheelwright's apprenticeship half finished and a set of hand tools wrapped in oilcloth that he would not let out of his sight on the crossing. He landed in Ohio because a cousin had landed in Ohio, and he built wagon wheels and later coach bodies for 30 years in a shop 3 blocks from where my own shop stands now, though the building's gone to a laundromat, and I try not to think about that too hard when I drive past. Otto was, by every account I ever heard, including his own, a difficult man to work for and an easy man to admire from a slight distance, which described most of the immigrant craftsmen of that generation. He believed a tool should outlive the man who made it, and he believed a man who bought a tool instead of earning the skill to deserve it had bought himself a lie. In 1888, 3 years off the boat and already known around the county for the tightness of his joinery, he made himself a plow plane, the kind used for cutting grooves down the length of a board, as what the old trades called a journeyman's proof piece. Ebony body, ivory tips on the skate and the fence, brass thumbscrews he cast himself, and down inside the brass fence stop, so small you'd need a loop to find it, he stamped his mark, OR and the year. He wasn't proving it to a guild, not in Ohio in 1888. He was proving it to himself, and that, friend, is the kind of proof that lasts. I need you to sit with that plane a moment, because it is the second character in tonight's story, and it deserves an introduction as careful as any person's. It is not large. 14 inches, maybe, dark as a church pew, cool to the touch even in August, with a heft that surprises anyone who's only ever held a modern tool made of stamped steel and plastic. Otto used it for 60 years, on wagon spokes and later on the fine cabinet work he did in his retirement, when his hands had gotten too unsteady for wheels but not for smaller things. And when he died in 1957 at 89 years old, that plane went to my mother, his only daughter who had no earthly use for it and knew it, and who kept it wrapped in the same oilcloth in a cedar chest until the day she judged I was ready. I was ready, by her reckoning, the day I turned 24 and opened my own shop. That was 1976, friend, which means as of this summer I have had that plane in my own 2 hands for exactly 50 years. She didn't hand it to me with a speech. My mother wasn't a speech-giving woman. She set it on my new workbench, still in the oilcloth, and said, "Your grandfather made this before either of us was a thought in anybody's head, and it has never once been used carelessly, and I expect that to continue." Then she went and made coffee and left me alone with it, which was its own kind of instruction. I should tell you plainly that Otto never taught me a thing directly, hand over hand at a bench, the way you might picture it. He died in 1957. I was 5 years old, and my only true memory of the man is the smell of pipe tobacco and sawdust when he held me once at a Christmas gathering, which is not a memory so much as a feeling wearing a memory's clothes. Everything I know of Otto's hands, I know second-hand from my mother, and later, more usefully, from the trade itself. I apprenticed at 16 in 1968 under a cabinet maker in town named Ed Halloran, a hard, precise, unsentimental teacher who ran his shop like a Swiss watch and had no patience for a boy who wanted to talk about his dead great-grandfather's legend instead of learning to cut a dovetail that didn't need glue to hold. Halloran gave me the hands. Otto, through my mother and later through that plane sitting on my new bench in 1976, gave me the reason the hands mattered. A trade without a reason behind it is just a job, friend, and I have always considered myself lucky to have both. I want to be honest about what that plane became to me over 50 years, because if I oversell it, you won't trust the rest of the story, and if I undersell it, you won't understand why losing it nearly finished me. It is not the tool I reached for every day. My daily planes are newer, duller in the romantic sense, honest working iron. Otto's plane came off the wall for the pieces that mattered. The blanket chest I built Nadine the year we married. The cradle, twice, 37 years apart, once for Kevin and once, more recently than I like to admit, for his boy. It came off the wall for a walnut jewelry box I built my daughter Beth the year she finished nursing school, and for the small oak box I built for my mother's ashes, which is the hardest sentence in tonight's story, and I'm not going to dwell on it. That plane touched maybe one project a year, but every man in this trade knows that a shop isn't measured by what's used every day. It's measured by what's on the wall for the day that matters, the way a church is measured by the bell nobody rings except at a wedding or a funeral. And I told my children about it. Both of them, but Kevin especially, because Kevin was the one who showed the early aptitude, the one whose hands I watched at that bench the way my mother must have watched mine. He was 16. I remember it specifically because it was the summer after his grandmother, my mother, passed, and he'd found the plane on the wall and asked why that one didn't get used like the others. And I told him the whole history, Otto and Stuttgart and the wagon wheels. And then, because I just read about it in a woodworking magazine and it had stuck with me the way a good fact sticks with a craftsman, I told him this. I said, Kevin, there was a plane just like this one, made by a company called Sandusky Tool, ebony and ivory just the same, that sold at auction the year before for $114,400, more than most people's houses. And your great-grandfather's plane is older than that one, and it's never left the family, and it's got his own mark stamped inside it, which the Sandusky one didn't. I told a 16-year-old boy that the wood and ivory tool on our wall might be worth more than money can comfortably say, and I watched his eyes go wide the exact way you'd want a boy's eyes to go. And then I said the sentence that is going to sit in the middle of this whole story like a stone in a shoe. I said, anybody can own a tool, Kevin. Only a fool sells one that was never really his to sell. He was 16. I didn't know I was writing his eulogy for a version of himself 30 years off. I just thought I was teaching him respect. Let me move us forward through the ordinary years quickly, because you don't need all 50, you need the shape of them. I married Nadine in 1975, the year before Otto's plane came to me, and we've been married 51 years this September, which she reminds me is longer than most of my tools have been in service, and she's not wrong. Kevin came in 1980, Bate in 1983. I built Prout Custom Furniture up from a one-man operation doing kitchen cabinets for neighbors into a small shop that, at its best years, employed 2 other craftsmen and had a 2-year wait list for dining tables. And I am proud of that in the plain way a man is proud of work he did with his own hands and never had to apologize for. Kevin worked beside me summers through high school and 2 years after, and I thought, friend, I genuinely thought, that the shop and everything in it, including Otto's plane, was going to be his one day, but what didn't hold him the way it holds a man who's going to do it for life. He liked the outdoors more than the bench, liked machines and diesel and dirt more than fine joinery, and at 22 he told me, decent about it, straightforward, that he wanted to start a landscaping company instead. And I'll tell you plainly, it stung for about a year and then it didn't, because Beth, unexpectedly, was the one who kept coming around the shop into her 30s, not to build. She never took to the bench either, but to sit and talk while I worked, the way her grandmother never quite managed with Otto. Different children love a trade in different ways. I made my peace with that a long time ago. Kevin's landscaping business, Prout Grounds, did fine for 24 years. Steady, not spectacular, the kind of small operation that survives on relationships and one good truck. And that truck is where this story actually starts to turn, so hold on to it. January the 9th, this year, a Friday, I was in the shop at 6 in the morning the way I have been for 50 years, gluing up a tabletop, and I felt a weight land on my chest like somebody had set a bag of Quikrete there. And then I was on the floor looking up at the underside of my own workbench, which I want you to know is not a view I recommend. The strange detail I remember clearest, clearer than the pain itself, is that I was still holding a bar clamp in my right hand, and some stubborn part of my brain, even going down, was worried about whether the glue joint would set crooked without it. 50 years of habit doesn't let go easy, friend, not even for a heart attack. Nadine found me 20 minutes later when I didn't come in for breakfast. The ambulance took 11 minutes, which felt, she told me after, like 11 years. And by the time they had me in the emergency bay, my blood pressure had dropped low enough that the young doctor stopped speaking to Nadine in the careful, hedging language doctors use when they still believe in a good outcome, and started speaking to her the other way. Triple bypass, the surgeon told her, and touch and go for the first 2 days. And I want to tell you honestly, friend, I remember almost none of the hospital. What I remember, the one clear memory from those first foggy days, is Kevin's face leaning over the bed rail, and me, doped up on whatever they had me on, gripping his wrist and saying over and over, "The shop, Kevin, watch the shop." And he said, "Dad, I've got it, I promise. Don't you worry about the shop." I have turned that promise over in my hands more times in the last 6 months than I have turned over any board in 50 years of woodworking. I was in the hospital 18 days. Complications, a lung infection on top of the surgery, the kind of thing that happens more than they tell you at 74. And in those 18 days, and the 5 weeks of cardiac rehab that followed at a facility across town, my son and my daughter-in-law made a decision I did not know about until I was standing in the empty half of my own shop. And I need to tell you honestly how that decision got made, because it is not the story of a cruel man. And that, somehow, is worse. Kevin's business truck, the F-350 that hauled every mower and mulcher and stump grinder he owned, threw a transmission in the second week of my hospital stay. Repair estimate, $4,100, money Kevin did not have, because landscaping is a cash-poor trade in January regardless of the state of a man's heart. He was 3 weeks from losing his single largest asset in the dead of winter with a father in intensive care and a mortgage payment due. And Nadine, exhausted, frightened, signing paperwork at my bedside she barely had the bandwidth to read, had given him a limited power of attorney the first week, for paying my bills, the electric, the shop's insurance, the small ordinary debts of a household with its head in a hospital bed. She gave him authority to manage $1,200 a month in bills. She did not give him authority to empty a shop. Nobody did. Kevin decided that on his own, on a Tuesday night, sitting at his kitchen table with Tammy, his wife of 19 years, doing math that came out short no matter how many times they ran it. Tammy is not a villain in this story either, and I want to be fair the way I've tried to be fair my whole life, because fairness outlasts anger, friend. I've learned that the hard way. Tammy's the one, I found out later, who said the sentence that actually made it happen. She said, Kevin, your dad is 74. He just had a triple bypass. The doctor's telling us he might never stand at a bench 8 hours a day again. And you're about to lose the truck that feeds your kids over a shop full of tools that might just sit there gathering dust for the rest of his life anyway. And I understand the arithmetic of that sentence. I have never once, in 6 months of turning it over, been able to say the arithmetic was crazy. It was only wrong. They called a man named Dale Ferris, an estate liquidator and antique tool dealer who advertises in the county paper, the kind of man who buys out barns and basements and workshops when somebody dies or moves into assisted living, and who has, I'll grant him this now, though I couldn't grant him anything for a long while, an honest local reputation. Dale came out on a Thursday afternoon while I lay in a hospital bed 40 minutes away learning to walk to a bathroom door and back, walked the shop with Kevin for maybe 40 minutes, and made a lot offer for everything. Benches, clamps, the table saw, 40 years of hand tools including everything on the wall, the whole contents, as is, one number, no itemizing, $2,700. Kevin, by his own later account, thought that sounded like a great deal of money for a bunch of old tools his father hadn't touched in a week because he was busy trying not to die. And he signed the bill of sale that afternoon, and by Saturday morning, while I was asking a nurse if I could please have real coffee instead of decaf. 2 men in a box truck had cleared my shop down to the bare walls and swept the floor on their way out, which is, if you want to know the detail that undid me most when I finally saw it, almost worse than if they'd left it a mess. A clean floor looks like nothing ever happened there. I came home the first week of February. Nadine had warned me, in the careful way she warns me about things, that Kevin had, quote, done some cleaning up in the shop to make it easier on me. And I want you to know I pictured a swept floor and some reorganized shelving, because that is the most generous interpretation a man's mind reaches for when he loves his son, and his heart is currently held together with wire. I walked out there on my own 2 feet, against doctor's orders, the second afternoon I was home, because a shop is a place a man needs to see with his own eyes and not be told about. And I opened that door, friend, and I stood in a room 40 feet by 26 that I have occupied nearly every working day of 50 years, and it was empty. Not messy, not rearranged, empty. Bare studs where the tool wall used to be, pale rectangles of unfaded wood where 40 years of frames and shadow boards had kept the sun off, my grandfather's workbench, the one Otto himself built with his own hands in 1920, and that I inherited along with the plane, simply gone. 4 ghost outlines in the dust on the concrete where its feet had stood for 6 years in this shop, and God knows how many before that in his. I did not fall down, though a part of me expected to. I stood in the doorway of a room I had built my whole identity inside of, and I could not, for a long moment, make my mouth produce a single word, which for a man who talks as much as I do, friend, tells you something about the size of the thing. I found the oilcloth on the floor in the corner, empty, tossed aside like a grocery bag. That's how I knew, before I knew anything else, exactly what was gone. I want to tell you one more detail from that afternoon, because it's the one Nadine says she still can't discuss without her voice going thin. On the one shelf that hadn't been fully cleared, the men had left, of all things, a coffee can of bent nails I'd been meaning to sort for years and never gotten to, sitting alone in the middle of 40 feet of bare shelving like a joke nobody meant to tell. I stood there and laughed, one short ugly bark of a laugh that had no humor in it at all, because it was such a precise, almost surgical kind of loss. They had taken everything worth taking and left me exactly the one thing worth throwing away. I'm not going to walk you through the shouting, because there wasn't much, and what there was, I'm not proud of, and it isn't the useful part of this story anyway. I called Kevin that evening and asked him, as level as I could manage, where my grandfather's tools were, and there was a silence on the line I will remember the rest of my life. The silence of a grown man realizing in real time that he has done something he cannot undo. And then he said the sentence, the one I promised you at the top of this story. He said, "Dad, you weren't going to use them again." The doctor said. I just thought and I said, and this is the only thing I said that night that I'd say again exactly the same way. I said, "Kevin, do you remember the ebony plane? The one your great-grandfather stamped his own initials into? Do you remember what I told you it was worth, standing at that same bench when you were 16 years old?" And there was another silence, longer than the first, and in it I could hear, friend, I could actually hear a grown man's memory reaching back 30 years and coming up empty, because he genuinely, honestly, did not remember. He'd sold it in a job lot with the clamps and the drop cloths, one item among 90, because it was dark and old and didn't look like much to a man who'd never learned to read a tool the way I'd spent 30 years trying to teach him, one story at a time, and apparently failed. I didn't sleep that week. I'm going to tell you plainly what those first days were, because I think men my age don't say this enough, and it does nobody any good to pretend otherwise. It wasn't anger, mostly. It was grief, the specific grief of losing a person twice, because that shop and those tools were Otto to me nearly as much as any photograph. And I had now lost my grandfather a second time, 48 years after I lost him the first time, sold for $2,700 by a man who loved me and simply never learned to see what he was looking at. Nadine found me out in that empty shop at 2 in the morning more than once, sitting on an overturned bucket in the dark because we didn't even own a chair out there anymore, and she'd stand in the doorway and not say anything, because after 51 years she knows the difference between a silence that needs company and one that needs solitude, and mine needed both at once, which only a wife of that many years knows how to provide simultaneously. Bate is the one who finally made me move, 10 days or so after I found the empty shop. She drove over, sat me down at my own kitchen table and said, "Dad, sitting on a bucket isn't going to bring great-grandpa Otto's plane back, but knowing where it went might." She's a nurse, not a detective, but she has the useful stubbornness of both. She tracked Dale Ferris down through his advertisement in the county paper, called him directly, and asked plainly whether he still had the contents of the Porch shop or whether he'd already sold pieces off. And Dale, to his credit, and I want to give him this credit in full because it matters enormously to how this story ends, told her the truth without being made to. He said most of it had already moved. The common tools, the clamps, the table saw, sold as a working lot to another shop 2 counties over within a week of buying it. The way an honest reseller turns over inventory. But the ebony plane, he said, he'd pulled aside the moment he uncrated the lot back at his own place, because in 18 years of buying out barns and basements he had learned to recognize when something in a job lot didn't belong in a job lot, and an ebony-bodied plow plane with ivory tips and a hand-cast brass fence, sitting among garage sale chisels, had made the hair stand up on the back of his neck, the way it does for a man who's handled 10,000 ordinary tools and finally holds an extraordinary one. Here is where I have to tell you about Dale Ferris properly, because he is the reason this story ends the way it does and not the other way, and a story owes its better angels a fair introduction same as it owes its worse ones. Dale is 58. Ran a hardware store for 20 years before it went under to the big chains, and turned his knowledge of old tools into the estate liquidation business afterward. Because a man who knows the difference between a $50 wrench and a $500 wrench can make an honest living off other people's ignorance. And I want to be careful with that sentence. Because there are 2 ways to make that living, an honest way and a predatory one. And everything that happened next is the story of which one Dale chose when nobody but his own conscience was watching. The day after he uncrated my grandfather's plane, Dale drove it 2 hours to a tool historian he knew from the collector circuit, a retired appraiser named Marion Kessler who has, Dale told me later, forgotten more about 19th century American plane making than most museums ever knew. Marion examined the ebony, the ivory, the hand-cast brass, and then, using a jeweler's loupe on the underside of the fence stop, found the mark. OR 1888. She spent the better part of 2 weeks after that running it against auction catalogs and collector registries, because a stamped mark on an unrecorded maker means nothing on its own. It needs provenance, a paper trail, corroborating pieces, before it means money. Dale told me she'd called him twice during those 2 weeks just to ask fresh questions, once about the specific grain pattern of the ebony, which she thought might narrow down the timber's origin, and once, oddly, about whether the family had any photographs of Otto's original wagon shop. Because a workbench visible in the background of an old photograph can sometimes corroborate a tool the same way a signature corroborates a painting. That is not the kind of diligence a dishonest appraiser bothers with, friend, and I think it's worth saying so. And she found, in a 1962 Regional Woodworking Guild newsletter digitized by a historical society, one paragraph, a single paragraph, friend, about a German immigrant wheelwright in that same Ohio county who had been locally known for ebony and ivory joinery tools he made for himself and never sold, a craftsman who died in 1957. Otto Reinholt's name was in that paragraph. That is what turned $2,700 of job lot junk into what Marion's written appraisal, dated the second week of March, called a documented, exceptionally rare, single-owner provenance ebony plow plane in outstanding original condition. Fair market value estimated between $36,000 and $42,000 at specialty auction, with the potential, her letter said, to exceed that range significantly if two or more serious collectors of American infill planes pursued it against each other in the room. $40,000, friend, near enough, for the piece my son had sold, unknowingly, unweighed, unexamined, folded into 90 other items for $2,700 total. I want you to sit with that gap for a second the way I had to. Not the gap between 2,700 and 40,000, though that gap is obscene enough on its own. The gap between a boy who was told, at 16, exactly what that object could be worth in the world, and the man he became, who looked straight at it 30 years later and saw a dark old plane not worth separating from the drop claws. Dale told me all of this himself, sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in April, 4 days before he was scheduled to consign the plane to a specialty tool auction in Ohio with an estimate that would have made the sale, and him, a very tidy profit on a $2,700 buy. He'd gotten Bates' number from their earlier phone call and called her first, not me, because he said, and I believe him, he wasn't sure yet what kind of man he was about to be dealing with, and he wanted somebody in the family to vouch that I wasn't going to come at him with a lawyer over a legal transaction he'd conducted in good faith. He came to my house instead of a lawyer's office, alone with Marion's appraisal letter and the plane itself, wrapped, I noticed, in a clean towel not tossed loose in a truck bed the way it had left my shop. I have to tell you honestly what he said, word close to word, because I've replayed it enough times to have it near verbatim. He set the wrapped plane on my kitchen table, unwrapped it himself, careful, the way you'd unwrap something that used to belong to somebody's grandfather, and he said, Mr. Prout, I bought this fair. Your son signed a bill of sale. I paid what we agreed, and by every rule of my business, what happens next is mine to decide, and nobody could tell me different in a court of law. And then he said, but I've been doing this 18 years, and I've bought out plenty of shops from families who were glad to see the tools go, and a few from families who weren't. And somewhere in the last 2 months I found out which kind of sale this was. He said he'd stopped at the hardware store in town for a supply run, mentioned to the counter man, old habit, professional gossip, that he'd picked up a reel find off a Prude estate, and the counter man who'd known me 30 years had said estate. Gene Prute's not dead, he had a bypass in January, he's still living right up the road. Dale said that sentence sat wrong in his stomach for a week before he let himself examine why. He said, I could take this to auction Saturday and clear better than $35,000 profit over what I paid, and not one soul in this state could say I did anything but good business. And then he looked at me, 74 years old, 4 months off a bypass, sitting at my own kitchen table across from the last piece of my grandfather I had left in the world, and he said, but I've got a father too, Mr. Prute, and he's 81. And I keep picturing somebody clearing out his shed while he was flat on his back in a hospital bed and calling it help. I can't spend money that feels like that. So he made me an offer. He'd take back exactly what he'd paid for the whole lot, the full $2,700, no interest, no markup, nothing for his gas or his time or the 2 weeks Marion had spent chasing down a dead man's newsletter clipping, and the plane would come back to my wall. I want you to notice, friend, that he did not offer to split the $40,000 with me, which would have made him a hero in most tellings of a story like this. He offered to walk away from $35,000 of clean legal profit for nothing but the feeling of not having to know, the rest of his life, that he was the kind of man who could. I wrote him a check for $2,700 right there at the table, and my hand was not steady doing it, and Nadine, standing behind my chair with both hands on my shoulders, was crying before I finished signing my name, and Dale, to his credit, looked almost embarrassed by the whole thing. The way an honest man does when he's just been thanked for behaving the way he'd have wanted everybody to assume he would. Now, I promised you this story ends with justice, and I want to be honest that the justice in it isn't the kind where the wrongdoer gets struck by lightning, because that's not how families work, and it's not how this one worked either. Kevin found out what the plane was actually worth the same week Dale drove it back to me, because I called him, not to punish him, though I won't pretend some part of me wasn't tempted, but because a man deserves to know the truth about what he's done plainly, once, and then be allowed to carry it. I told him the appraisal figure. $36,000 to $42,000, I said, for the one item, alone, out of the 90 you let go for $2,700 total. And I heard on the other end of that call a grown man, 46 years old, owner of his own small business, make a sound I hadn't heard out of him since he was small enough to fall off a bicycle. And I let the silence sit there, friend, because some silences are the son's to fill, not the father's. He drove over that same night, sat across from me at that same kitchen table, and he didn't ask for forgiveness right off, which I respected, because a man who asks for forgiveness before he's finished sitting with what he did is usually asking to feel better faster than the damage deserves. He just sat there and said, Dad, I sold Grandpa Otto twice. Once when he died, and once for $2,700 while you were in a hospital bed telling me to watch the shop. And I told him, if it's worth anything, that I'd told him at 16 years old exactly what that plane could be worth, using almost the exact figure Marion's letter came back with 30 years later, and he sat with that a long moment and said he genuinely did not remember the conversation at all, not one piece of it, and that not remembering was, in some ways, the worst part of the whole 6 months, because it meant the fault wasn't only in the panic of one bad week. It was in 30 years of a boy who loved his father and never once learned to see what his father was trying to show him. The town found out too, the way small towns do, through the hardware store counter man and the tool collector circuit, and eventually a short piece in the county paper about a rare local find nearly lost to an estate sale. And I won't lie to you, friend, that piece cost Kevin something in this community that money can't buy back quickly. Men he'd mowed lawns for 20 years asked him, not always kindly, whether he'd sold his own father's tools while the man was in the hospital. He took that on the chin, every bit of it, because he'd decided on his own, without me asking, that taking it on the chin was the only honest response available to him. He didn't hide. He didn't blame Tammy or the truck or the bank. He told anyone who asked the plain, embarrassing truth. And a man who does that, in my experience, is a man who's learned something a scolding never would have taught him. And here's the part I most want you to carry out of tonight's story, because it's the part that turned 6 months of grief into something closer to grace. Kevin didn't try to pay me back in money, which I wouldn't have accepted anyway. $2,700 had already been squared with Dale, and the matter financially was closed. He started showing up at the shop instead. Saturday mornings first, then some weeknights after his own work was done, not saying much, just helping me rebuild what Dale's truck had emptied out, a shelf at a time, a bench at a time, because Otto's original workbench, it turned out, had been the one item in the whole lot Dale's buyer 2 counties over hadn't wanted, too heavy and too old-fashioned for a modern shop, and Dale, once he understood the whole story, drove 2 hours himself to buy it back from that shop at a loss and haul it home to me in his own truck, refusing again to take a dime over what he'd paid to retrieve it. We set Otto's bench back against the same wall it had stood against for 6 years, in the same 4 ghost outlines the dust had kept for us, and on a Sunday afternoon in June, Kevin standing next to me the way he had at 16 years old and hadn't much since, I took the ebony plane down off the wall for the first time since it came home. And I did the thing that mattered more than any appraisal figure Marion Kessler ever wrote down. I put it in his hands. Kevin's boy, Tyler, was out in the yard that Sunday, 9 years old, and he wandered in partway through and stood in the doorway the way children do when they sense something is happening that they're not quite included in but don't want to miss anyway. I waved him over. Figured, friend, that a story worth telling twice was worth telling to 3 generations standing at the same bench, since that's exactly how Otto's story had traveled to begin with, my mother to me to Kevin, and apparently, somewhere along the way, dropped. I said, Kevin, I'm not giving you this to own outright, not yet, maybe not ever, because I've learned this year that ownership isn't really the thing that gets passed down in a family like ours. I'm giving it to you to hold right now, while I tell you one more time, and I want you to actually hear it this time, what your great-grandfather Otto believed about a tool like this. I told him the whole history again, Stuttgart and the wagon wheels and the proof piece and the mark hidden inside the brass where nobody but a jeweler's loop would ever find it. And I told him the Sandusky figure again, $114,400 in 1995, and Marion's figure, $36,000 to $42,000 for ours, and I watched my son, 46 years old, hold an object worth more than his truck and his mower and most of his equipment combined, and turn it over slowly in the light from the shop window the way a man turns over something he has finally, actually, learned to see. And then I said the sentence again, the one from 30 years ago, the one that had sat forgotten in him the whole time it should have been standing guard. Anybody can own a tool, Kevin. Only a fool sells one that was never really his to sell. And this time, friend, this time I watched it land. I watched it land the way a nail finally seats true after 3 crooked swings. He didn't say much. He's not a man of many words, my son, never has been. That's Bates' gift, not his. He just nodded and set the plane down on Otto's bench, gentle, both hands, the way you'd set down something borrowed from a museum. And he said, I'm not selling anything of yours again. Dad, not ever, not even if you tell me to. And I believe him. The way you believe a man who's already paid the price of learning a lesson the expensive way and has no appetite left for paying it twice. Tyler, 9 years old, had stood there through the whole retelling with the particular stillness kids get when a story is landing somewhere they don't have words for yet. And when his father set the plane down, he asked, quiet, "Is it really worth $40,000? And Kevin looked at his own son a long moment before he answered, and what he said wasn't the number. He said, "It's worth more than that, bud. It's worth whatever it costs you to learn to actually look at what's in front of you. And I paid that price already, so hopefully you won't have to." I don't know if a 9-year-old can carry a sentence like that the whole way, friend, but I know his father meant it down to the floorboards, and I know I'll be telling that boy the whole story again myself, at that same bench, the day he turns 11, and hoping the third time in this family is the one that finally sticks. The plane's back on the wall now, ebony and ivory catching the porch light through the shop window some evenings when I work late. $40,000 of dark old wood that I would not sell for $400,000. Because Otto was right in 1888, and I was right telling a 16-year-old boy in a shop 30 years ago. And my son is right now, finally, at 46, and it only took a bypass. An empty shop, and one honest stranger with a conscience heavier than his profit margin, to get the whole family reading off the same page. Dale Ferris still buys estate lots around this county, and I'll tell you plainly, if you ever need to clear a shop or a barn or a basement in this part of Ohio, you call that man, because I have seen, up close, what the other kind of man would have done with what he found in mine, and I have seen what Dale did instead. And the difference between those two men is worth more than any appraisal Marion Kessler ever put on paper. So that's the story, friend, and here's what I'd leave you with, if you're the kind of person this finds tonight. Somewhere in your life there is probably a version of that 16-year-old boy at the bench, somebody you told something important to once, plainly, carefully, and trusted the telling to be enough. It usually isn't enough the first time. People forget. Pressure makes them forget faster and more completely than you'd believe possible. And it isn't always because they didn't love you. It's because panic has a way of flattening 30 years of a good lesson down to nothing in one bad week. Tell them again. And if you're the one who's forgotten something somebody tried to teach you, at a bench or a kitchen table or anywhere else, it is not too late to pick the lesson back up, even if picking it up costs you something public and embarrassing, the way it cost my son. The wood remembers what the hand forgets, friend, if you give the hand a chance to touch it again. It's evening here now. Nadine's got coffee going, the real kind. Decaf hasn't been allowed in this house since February, and I've made my peace with that too. Kevin's truck is in the driveway, the new transmission long since paid off the honest way, one landscaping season at a time. And out in the shop, on Otto's bench, under a lamp that throws just enough light to work by, there's a plane worth $40,000 sitting exactly where a plane like that belongs, which is to say, in use, in a family, being seen for what it actually is. And the porch light's on. It always is. If this story found you somewhere quiet tonight, stay a while. There's a new one on this porch every week, and the light's on for you too. This has been the Porch Light. This story, like all stories told here, is an original work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental. Good night, friend. Drive safe going home.